Hello, everybody. Another year, another Heaney. So first of all, thanks to Jerry and Viola and Niall for all the work they've done to organise what is now a permanent part of the Liverpool calendar, not just the university's calendar. And thank you all especially for coming out on such a cold night. It's definitely the time for the big coat. And hello also to the Heaney family, who have slipped into our social world seamlessly. We appreciate them very much, and they're good fun in the pub. Anyway, we're here to talk about important things. So recently, I was sitting on that Twitter thing, which we all must get off soon, and there was a meme, or whatever you call it, came up, and it was some quote that Heaney had made about poetry doesn't end wars, but it helps us cope with them, it helps us understand, and it helps us sort of escape from the whole injurious nature of violence. And of course, culture stimulates then all of the connections you have to that type of understanding of what culture does when we look at violence. And I maybe think of Anna Burns. I don't know if you've read Anna Burns' book, Milkman, which seems to create very Marmite-type opinions. But to me, Anna Burns is one of the best books written about the Troubles. Maybe that's a personal thing, because the book is this flow of consciousness in which she's living in our down, and people in her community are telling her she's not nationalist enough. When she goes and stands at the interface between the Catholic and Protestant area, she knows the people across the road hate her, and all she wants to be is an individual. And I think the whole point of what a lot of what Heaney's work was about was working with that struggle of being in a conflict, but trying to get us to think about that conflict in very different ways. So the whole process of labelling and harm and all of that which it creates. Of course, one of the best pieces of Milkman by Anna Burns is when the cat stands on a bomb and the politicians on TV that night blame each other, only to find out that the cat had stood in a bomb dropped by the Luftwaffe in 1944. So in many ways, I think a connection with culture and a connection with Heaney, and especially growing up in Belfast, was the way in which that cultural medium was mixed into, like Anna Burns' struggle, the desire to find something which wasn't what you were told to be. Ska, punk, and of course William Blake prose, and more importantly Seamus's poetry. So I think that's the sort of personal fascination I have with it, because it spoke to that being a young man collecting different ways to not be the stereotype that you were supposed to be. And in a fashion, all of that was replete with a vocabulary of plurality that you weren't getting anywhere else, and the multiple meaning which comes across very strongly in North, which examines the Troubles and understands the Troubles, and the way it incorporates the historical with the mythological, and the way in which words are used by Seamus Heaney to convey that sense of despair and the longing for peace. I returned to a long strand, the hammered curve of a bay, and found only the secular flatness of the drenched land. And I think that just speaks. He looks at the physical landscape and he thinks of the harm that people do to each other. And I think this is really important, and it was really important at that time, because Heaney was reminding us that we had stretched away from nature, that we had moved away from the meaning of nature. We treated land as territory. We treated land as some rhetorical history, as opposed to actually using this sort of Hegelian sense that we could and should be better. And I think that whole way in which he sort of encourages us to adopt the social ecology, not of Anna Burns' world being spoken to in both ears, but a social ecology in which we actually understand that our actions are actually alienating ourselves. We're alienating ourselves from who we should be and who we could be. And I think Seamus Heaney cared about people, and he strikes me as the sort of person who watched people, being a country person, of course, You watch everything that's going on around you. And I think he understood very well people's moods and talents and shortcomings and tastes. And he wished better for people. And he did that without finger pointing. What he actually did was he offered us all a better vision of ourselves. And I think we can't underestimate how important that is. So, I'm trying to think of a link here. Somebody I also think who captures the essence of the tortured and the alienated is Denise Gough. We just had a very private conversation about somebody which I will not repeat in public. And I have to say, in Duncan Macmillan's People, Place and Things, you are absolutely exceptional at representing the themes of addiction and the complexity and the edge and the obsessiveness of personality. Okay? I'm a grumpy Protestant from the north. That's praise. Take it. Take it and run away. It only happens once a year that I praise people. But that play, Duncan Macmillan's, if you haven't been to see it or read it, People, Place and Things, every time I see the title of that play, I think of Seamus Heaney. Because Seamus Heaney wrote People, Place and Things. And it always I've got a very strange mind. Anyway, that's how it affected me, and you were exceptional in that. Okay. Now, you're also a trained singer. Yes. You've deservedly won many. You've got this CV, which is award. Okay. And of course, you have developed, and I think, in having watched your career, hope you don't mind me saying, I'm not saying you were rubbish at one time. But what I'm saying, we all started somewhere. But I think what is important is in watching you develop in your career from a very good point to start at. Okay, I'm digging myself out now. I think what comes across in all of your work that you do is your capacity to understand and to realise and to grasp the people that you play. So thank you very much for coming to see us tonight. And you have to stop being so successful and give the rest of us a chance. Okay? So, would you come and read us a few poems? Thank you.
I'm not really used to seeing everyone. It's so bright in here. But also, I started my career in Liverpool, so this is a really... I feel really... Yeah, it started and ended in Liverpool. So I'm really, really happy to be here and to be reading Seamus Heaney. Thank you so much for asking me. So the first poem is Limbo. Fishermen at Ballyshannon netted an infant last night along with the salmon. An illegitimate spawning, a small one thrown back to the waters. But I'm sure as she stood in the shallows, ducking him tenderly till the frozen knobs of her wrists were dead as the gravel, he was a minnow with hooks tearing her open. She waded in under the sign of the cross. He was hauled in with the fish. Now Limbo will be a cold gutter of souls through some far briny zone. Even Christ's palms, unhealed, smart, and cannot fish there. And the next poem is By Child. He was discovered in the hen house where she had confined him. He was incapable of saying anything. When the lamp glowed a yoke of light in their back window, the child in the outhouse put his eye to a chink. Little henhouse boy, sharp-faced as new moons remembered, your photo still glimpsed like a rodent on the floor of my mind. Little moon man, kennelled and faithful at the foot of the yard, your frail shape, luminous, weightless, is stirring the dust. The cobwebs, old droppings under the roosts, and dry smells from scraps she put through your trapdoor morning and evening. After those footsteps, silence, vigils, solitudes, fasts, unchristened tears, a puzzled love of the light. But now you speak at last, with a remote mime of something beyond patience, your gaping, wordless proof of lunar distances travelled beyond love. And finally, clearances. This is a sequence of 8 sonnets written in memory of Seamus Heaney's mother, and these are the first 3. 1. A cobble thrown 100 years ago keeps coming at me, the first stone aimed at a great-grandmother's turncoat brow. The pony jerks and the riot's on. She's crouched low in the trap, running the gauntlet that first Sunday down the brae to Mass at a panicked gallop. He whips on through the town to cries of Lundy. Call her the convert, the exogamous bride. Anyhow, it is a genre piece inherited on my mother's side and mine to dispose with now she's gone. Instead of silver and Victorian lace, the exonerated stone. 2. Polished linoleum shone there, brass taps shone. The china cups were very white and big, an unchipped set with sugar bowl and jug. The kettle whistled, sandwich and tea scone were present and correct. In case it run, the butter must be kept out of the sun. And don't be dropping crumbs. Don't tilt your chair. Don't reach, don't point. Don't make noise when you stir. It is number 5, New Row, Land of the Dead, where grandfather is rising from his place with spectacles pushed back on a clean, bald head to welcome a bewildered, homing daughter before she even knocks. What's this? What's this? And they sit down in the shining room together. And 3. When all the others were away at Mass, I was all hers as we peeled potatoes. They broke the silence, let fall one by one, like solder weeping off the soldering iron. Cold comfort set between us, things to share gleaming in a bucket of clean water, and again let fall. Little pleasant splashes from each other's work would bring us to our senses. So while the parish priest at her bedside went hammer and tongs at prayers for the dying, and some were responding and some crying, I remembered her head bent towards my head, her breath in mine, our fluent dipping knives, never closer the whole rest of our lives.
Thank you. Very good, thank you. It's the mother putting the potatoes always gets me. It always gets me. Claire, you have come to join us tonight from Cambridge, and we're very delighted that you've come to see us and talk to us. And of course, you've been one of those scholars who's helped define Ireland in the ways that it should be defined. In many ways, your work has taken us beyond post-nationalism. It's taken us beyond the invisibility of women, the invisibility of the marginalised. And I think very much your voice and your work speaks of that generation which decided to not be trapped by the old shibboleths and the old ideologies, and to present us with something which truly represents where Ireland has gone and what it has become. Your work has spoken on the politics and sexuality in Northern Ireland, very important work which wasn't being done at that time. It was certainly not in the way that you presented it. Neutrality in World War II, the hidden British soldiers, the way they were treated for many years, abandoned and vilified, by going off to fight fashion. I'm sure some just went for the excitement as well. 1916, which in many ways we can reimagine and understand, yet again, the invisibility of women and the airbrushing, actually the literal airbrushing of women out of the narrative of 1916. And of course, I'm sure everybody in here, many of you are here because you're immigrants or the children of immigrants, the whole way in which the loss of social and human capital due to immigration and the impact that had upon our societies. My mother was the youngest of 11. Anybody who was qualified was sent away, money sent home. And the whole detachment from their homes and their places was all something which was a sort of a major human tragedy in our history. So, will you come and join us and tell us what you have to say about Seamus Heaney?
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. I'd like to thank the Institute for Irish Studies and the Heaney family for your invitation. And I'm just going to get going. I'm just going to check the time. A cobble thrown 100 years ago keeps coming at me. So begins that first poem in Clarence's Seamus Heaney's elegiac sequence for his mother. Heaney's poem reminds us that we have work to do in relation to the histories we inherit. The cobble thrown 100 years ago isn't in itself evidence of anything. It's part of a story and comes packaged in a genre. It is, he says, a genre piece inherited on my mother's side and mine to dispose of now she's gone. I want to think about how we dispose of the stories we inherit, how we marshal them and put them to work. What is our responsibility to family stories and family silences? And what, in turn, can they teach us about responsibility? Clarence's is, amongst other things, a sequence of poems about what is not said, or what is said without words. There's the silence of Heaney's parents' marriage. You didn't get to hear this bit, but it's in a later poem in the sequence. In the last minutes, he said more to her, almost, than in all their life together. And this is mirrored in the silent communication between mother and son, passing messages through the splash of the fall of peeled potatoes, or their various manoeuvres for keeping allied and at bay. I'm thinking of Heaney's governing of his tongue when speaking with his mother, using the wrong grammar, or the distancing ballet charted through folding sheets, coming close again by holding back in moves where I was X and she was O. Communication takes place in code. It's a matter of interpreting signs relayed through grammar, a dance of noughts and crosses, or the touch of elbow to elbow during the prayers of Easter week. In the absence of such bodily signs, the maternal space is utterly empty, he says at the end of the sequence, yet utterly a source, a soul ramifying and forever silent, beyond silence, listened for. A few years earlier, Heaney had used this same image of an utterly empty space to describe the air hovering over the carcass of a family dog in the third section of Station Island, where he's visited by memories of a seashell-encrusted trinket that once belonged to his Aunt Agnes. When, as a child, he foraged for it in the oak sideboard, he says, it was like touching birds' eggs, robbing the nest of the word wreath, as kept and dry and secret as her name, which they hardly ever spoke, but was a white bird trapped inside me, beating scared wings when health of the sick fluttered its pray for us in the litany. Aunt Agnes is both there and not there, known but rarely spoken of. The child Heaney can touch something of her when he gets inside the oak sideboard, can feel her beating inside him in his own fear, but he can't hear her. Just as we, as readers, can't hear the speech of either mother or child in the poem Limbo, or the spectral gestured language of the henhouse boy in By Child. Now you speak at last, says Heaney, with a remote mime of something beyond patience, your gaping worldless proof of lunar distances travelled beyond love. In what follows, I want to think a bit about the ways in which those who are missing from our families, those who can't speak for themselves, may be the ones that shape them. In the process, I want to ask how we should approach the aftermath of the scandals of institutional abuse in Ireland. What questions should we be asking about guilt, blame, and responsibility in relation to our missing persons? I'll be tracing a history of sexual secrecy in Ireland from the post-famine period to the 1950s and beyond, asking how and why did families consent to the institutional care and control of unmarried mothers and their children. A different way of putting this question is to ask, why did the system make sense to ordinary families, and how can we make sense of it now? I'm going to be talking in particular about the aftermath of institutional control of women and children, and specifically the mother and baby home scandal that's been unfolding in Ireland following the work of the historian Catherine Corliss for over a decade now. Many of you may be very familiar with this, but I'm just going to sketch it for those here who may not know so much about it. I'm interested in particular in how we measure the fault line between public and private responsibility, the state and the family. I'm aware, of course, that although the family is a domain of intimate personal relationships, it would be wrong to categorise it as a private institution as opposed to public state enterprises such as industrial schools, Magdalene laundries, mother and baby homes and other church state-run social services. Where the fault line runs between public and private spheres, if it runs at all, is one of the questions I'm posing. For that reason, I'm continuing to use the word homes in discussing the legacy of the mother and baby institutions, despite the fact that many survivors of these institutions themselves refused to refer to them as homes. They weren't domestic spaces, they point out. They were effectively institutions of incarceration. And to use the word home is to attempt to deny or hide that fact. I don't disagree with this at all, but my point today is to try and analyse the ways in which the family home, too, is a social institution, implicated in the public sphere. And for that reason, I still find the word home useful. I mean by this, it still does useful work. Although my talk is primarily historical rather than theoretical, I'm bearing in mind too the history hidden in the words family and home, the familiar, the homely, and the unhomely. And here I'm glancing at Freud's work on the uncanny, the unheimlich, which carries within itself the heimlich, or the homely. Freud defined the uncanny as, I'm quoting, that class of frightening things that leads us back to what is known and familiar. For Freud, and for a century of Freudians writing in his wake, the heimlich, the homely, refers both to what is most familiar and familial and what is most hidden. He's thinking in particular of the mother's body as our first home. In the homely is hidden the strange, the frightening, the displaced, and at its furthest reach, the homeless. Another way we might put this is that the uncanny carries the canny, the knowing and the known within it, but denies it and covers it over. I want to return to this thought when considering the relationship between knowing and acknowledging that which is frightening in the family home. The familial, the everyday, the homely, and the domestic each functions through its own operations of violence, exclusion, and displacement, as well as love. The philosopher Stanley Cavell, in his essay Knowing and Acknowledging, calls this the surrealism of the habitual. He says, the difficulty of grasping what is before our eyes is not lack of knowledge, but acknowledgement. And that is one thread I will be following in this talk. The network of institutions that developed in the late 19th and early 20th centuries to manage sex and the consequences of sex in Ireland included the notorious Magdalen laundries, mother and baby homes, county homes, orphanages, and industrial schools, homes where children were taught industry, which for girls meant mostly being trained for domestic service and for boys farm labouring. You might think here of the homeboy Bill Evans in John McGahern's That They May Face the Rising Sun. His backstory is barely sketched in the novel. Part of McGahern's point here, I think, is that everyone knows about the children who have been brought up in the homes, so nothing needs to be explained. They know, but they don't acknowledge what is in front of them. Now, in his 50s, although his age is indeterminate like everything else about him, Bill Evans is enslaved to a shadowy farming couple who live up the hill from the Rutledges beside the lake. And the injustice is seen but unspoken. This set of social institutions, homes and orphanages, were run by religious orders, mostly Catholic, though there were some Protestant homes. James Joyce's story, Clay, is partly set in one of them. But following independence, they were funded by the Irish state through a system of payments for mothers and children. Basically, they were a cheap way for the Irish state to provide a range of social services, as the nuns didn't get paid for their work. Between Irish independence in 1922 and 1998, when the last of the mother and baby homes closed, they were home at the lowest estimate to 56,000 unmarried mothers, ranging from 12-year-old girls to women in their 40s, and at least 57,000 babies and small children. There were similar institutions in the United States, Britain, and many European countries. Nowhere else were they still in use as late as the 1990s. The proportion of Irish unmarried mothers who were admitted to these homes in the 20th century was probably the highest in the world, but that is not the only Irish anomaly. Irish women also stayed longer in these homes than anywhere else, with the longest stays occurring in the 1940s and 50s, where they stays of up to 3 or 4 years. A central finding of the Commission of Investigation into the Homes set up by the Irish government in 2014 was that in many of the homes, including Tuam and Bessborough, children were simply not cared for. In fact, in the 40 years following independence, being born in or living in one of the homes considerably lessened a child's chances of survival. The Commission came to other conclusions about the manner in which the homes functioned, vaccine trials in the early 1960s, the treatment of non-white children, and coerced adoption. All of their conclusions have proved controversial, but here I want to focus on the finding that caused the most outrage, which is that the primary responsibility, and I'm quoting here from the first page of the report, the primary responsibility for the treatment of women and children in the homes rests mainly with the fathers of their children and their own immediate families. It was supported by, contributed to, and condoned by the institutions of the state and the churches. Even if this statement were true, which I believe it isn't, it gets us nowhere. The attempts to parcel out blame for the treatment of unmarried mothers and their children, either to the institutional system or to families, is a misunderstanding of the nature of this history. I don't deny that families, my own included, made use of the homes, but what needs to be explained is why people consented to the system. Why did this system make sense to them? I think we can learn something about this from literature. McGahern's novel is a good example. What he shows in the plotline involving Bill Evans, the homeboy, is a small community tolerating human cruelty and injustice in the very next house, the very next farm, just behind the hedge, just over the back field. I think Heaney's poem By Child is another example in the same genre. There's embarrassment and awkwardness over the social consequences of a farming culture insistent upon respectability. Bill Evans is a kind of relic of a system that no one wants to condone now in the period in which the novel is set, sometime in the 1970s or 80s. But the plot also insists on the economic gains for the legitimate, the landowning farmer of this system built on the cheap labour of those who are illegitimate. The temporal markers in McGahern's novel are deliberately confusing. We can't tell at points whether we are in the 50s, the 70s, or even the 1990s when the book was written. And it's through this sort of historical muddying that McGahern is most articulate, I think, about the long aftermath of the abuse as it occurs inside families and farms and is continued in the family home as well as the institutional home. Or we could take Edna O'Brien's 1972 novel, A Pagan Place. The novel is an extraordinary indictment of the respectable farming family. The main character's older sister falls pregnant and is sent to a mother and baby home in Dublin and never returns, while the narrator herself, who's a 13, 14-year-old girl at the beginning of the story, is abused by a priest and rejects the family who support the priest instead of her. And in the end, she pays them back by becoming a nun in France. Here we see a shift from the violence of the family to the relative safety of the institution. Or we could think of the threads of stories touching on extramarital pregnancy, abortion, infanticide and class in the early fictions of Molly Keane and Dorothy McCardle, or John B. Keane's work, his 1959 play Scythe, for example, or the work of the popular dramatist M.J. Malloy in the 1950s and 60s, whose plays often focused on a class struggle between the illegitimate and the respectable. Or think of Mouth in Beckett's Not I, whose verbal gestures suggest she's been born in an institution and has never been fully accepted in society. What I'm gesturing towards here in this list of examples is the work of acknowledgement that writers were pushing towards in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. This world is touched on differently by Patrick Kavanagh in The Green Fool, Terry Flynn, and The Great Hunger, which we might think of as comic and tragic versions of the same story. And I'd like to suggest that many of the literary representations of single men in this period also point towards the unspoken history of these institutions. You see these lonely, bewildered, or defensive men everywhere in mid-century Irish literature. In Beckett, A. Joe, for example, his 1965 play for television. In John McGahern, in Tom Murphy, in John B. Keane. They very rarely get a backstory that has to do with sex or the politics of sexual respectability. That story is reserved for women who bear all the signs of it in their bodies, but the fathers are part of the story. Thousands of men whose futures also were curtailed, often by choice, insofar as choice is a factor in this history, and who never knew their children. I think that the brutality of that experience hasn't yet been acknowledged. In my recent book, Missing Persons, which is about this history, I wanted to excavate a more private history, and at this point I'm going to try to execute a tricky swerve away from literature that we're probably all more comfortable discussing, to a more personal history, one that was my way into the history of consent to these institutions. At the heart of my recent research is the life and death of one of the people who went missing from my own family, my first cousin Mary, who was born in an Irish mother and baby home, Bessborough in Cork, in 1955, and brought up in an orphanage or industrial school attached to the Convent of Mercy in Clonakilty, and who I never got to know. She was the daughter of my Uncle Jackie and his neighbour Lily, who was 19 when she got pregnant. I found out about Mary when I was in my 20s, when it was too late to meet her, although she was only 7 years older than me. And I spent decades trying to come to terms with the fact that she had been kept secret from the rest of us. In my own family's case, the family farm, the home, was a place of exclusion as well as belonging. Initially, I thought that the story I had to tell was Mary's story and that of her mother. I felt it as a kind of duty to do justice to the people who were shunned by the family and forced into institutions. It took me a long time to understand that, in fact, my story concerned the people who did the shunning. Central to this is the figure of my grandmother, who refused to accept my cousin as part of the family and never saw her son, Mary's father, again. I wanted to understand how a woman I knew very well when I was a child, a woman I loved, could have consented to a system which to us, a few generations later, seems immeasurably unjust and cruel. I wanted to call the book Making Sense of the Missing. The publisher didn't like it. That was my working title, and I meant two things by it. How did my grandmother and the others who were involved in disappearing my cousin make sense of what they were doing? Hang on. What page do I go to now? I may have missed a bit. Where did the sense of shame and the need to keep illegitimacy secret come from? And what was the work it did for families? The fact that my family functioned despite, and maybe even because of its missing persons, the fact that it made enough sense to me growing up, I didn't know anyone was missing, is part of my inheritance. And I want to suggest the inheritance of a great many people in my generation. I wanted to understand, through writing the book, not only what happened to the women who fell on the wrong side of sexual morality and social respectability, the women who ended up in mother and baby homes and their children, but also why it happened. Why did my uncle abandon Lily? Why did my grandmother refuse to acknowledge her grandchild? There are archival records for the institutions that governed and controlled Irish sexual and reproductive lives, but there are no written sources explaining the behaviour of the families of the women and children who ended up in these institutions, or there are very few. If I wanted to understand why families consented to the institutions, it made sense to start with my own family. and the sources that were available to me, the secrets that had been kept in my own family, and the secrets that weren't kept. The ellipses and misdirections built into the stories through which the family understood itself, and the generational battles over codes of behaviour, including who has the right to tell secrets and when. I think of these half-told stories in my family as like Heaney's genre piece, inherited on my mother's side. In the end, I came to understand that I am one of the records in this story. How sex and illegitimacy and the family has been policed in Britain and Ireland throughout the 20th century is archived in me and in my own attitudes, right down to my decision when I got pregnant as a student in the late 80s to go ahead and have the baby on my own. So, the book is an intimate history, literally so, in that I'm investigating illicit sex and extramarital pregnancy, but it's also public. My family was not unusual. Tens of thousands of women and girls were sent to mother and baby homes over the decades, and hundreds of thousands of people shunned them and their children. My grandmother's views on the importance of respectability and legitimate inheritance were typical. When Missing Persons was published in Ireland in January, I did some media interviews, and they nearly always started with a request to tell, will you tell people about your granny? And I ended up feeling that this line of questioning was getting it wrong. So I started responding, my granny is your granny. And although the interviewers looked a bit surprised, to their credit, they got the point that this is a personal story, but it's about a very common, almost universal situation in Ireland in which some people were allowed to belong in families and others weren't. And of course, not only in Ireland. This is where we might find ourselves pivoting on that pin between knowing and acknowledging. I'm interested in how a kind of violence gets covered over or disavowed and remembered at the same time. The church-state institutions that were set up to contain the poor and the sexually wayward and the mentally ill weren't in themselves secret. They were in the business of secrecy, but the system was highly visible, bureaucratic and officially sanctioned. It is precisely because such a huge amount of information about the homes and how they functioned was recorded that we now have the 3,000-page report of the Commission of Investigation, created on the basis of all that recorded information. So, the system was highly visible and involved a great many people, officials of church and state, yet it was barely talked about. And that contradiction shaped families too, and the way that people inside families understood their own experiences. In order to uncover how people in my family thought about illicit sex, illegitimacy, and institutions, I ended up following the tracks laid down in family stories and anecdotes. There were so many stories that petered out or that ended in kind of gaps, just bits missing, things that didn't make sense. I tried to interpret those gaps, the missing bits, as places where the past was both preserved and disavowed. One of the things I discovered while writing the book is that not only does my family stretch a long way back in only a few generations, my great-grandparents were born in the 1830s and 1840s, but in every single generation we've had children outside of marriage. Actually, my son's girlfriend's about to have a baby, so we're keeping the tradition going. It turned out that my grandmother had been pregnant before marriage in 1920, and I think there's a very high possibility that she may herself have been born out of wedlock in the early 1890s. I became fascinated by the different systems that developed to manage an unplanned pregnancy across a century or more, the different ways in which the secret of an unplanned pregnancy might be kept, and in particular, how sexual secrecy operated in the period before independence, before the mother and baby homes. There were all sorts of ways that an unplanned pregnancy could be managed informally in late Victorian and Edwardian Ireland. Abortion and infanticide, obviously, and it's worth pointing out here that juries were very reluctant to convict when these came to trial, but also shotgun weddings, informal fostering out, babies brought up by an aunt or a grandmother. I argue in the book that keeping sexual secrets in this period was a way for women to look out for one another. They had so little autonomy, so little control over their own lives, that keeping one another's secrets, covering them over, was one means of caring for one another. And I suggest that habits of secrecy developed in a period when the authorities and institutions were associated with alien rule, the police force, the workhouses, the county homes and so on, left people with very few defences against the new Catholic institutions that came into operation after independence. For several decades after the famine, the Catholic Church had a shaky hold on the rural Irish poor. There weren't enough churches or priests or nuns to go round. My grandfather was born in 1877, the youngest child of a Protestant labourer and a Catholic servant. The children were brought up Protestant, but their mother went to Mass in the Catholic Church. And this wasn't unusual, particularly among the very poor. But a generation later, it would be unthinkable. The Church steadily tightened its hold on its parishioners through the late decades of the 19th century. A massive church-building campaign, a drive for vocations. It was a civilising mission, if you like, and one of the consequences was a transformation of Irish family life. If we're trying to figure out why families consented to the institutions, the increasing power of the Catholic Church is obviously central. The deference to a homegrown Catholic religious authority after independence, a kind of fatalistic acceptance of one's lot, a genuine belief in the sinfulness of the body. There are lots of threads that join together to make this particular piece of social fabric. But just imagine how reassuring to find that the problem of extramarital pregnancy was going to be solved by the Church. Suddenly, here was your local priest, or your aunt, the nun, or your friends and neighbours saying, "The mother and baby home will keep your secret for you." It must have seemed the sensible thing to do if you wanted to preserve your respectability, to hand your daughter over to the priest to manage the problem. I suggest in the book that rural Irish families didn't really have any defences against what appeared to be a benign form of social welfare. This was their own people saying, "We'll keep your secret for you." But I don't underestimate the terrible experiences of loss and pain that families went through by consenting to this system. I've been focusing on the authority of the Church, but a large part of the story of consent needs to be understood as consequences of struggles over land ownership. Recently, President Michael D. Higgins has been talking about the centenary of the 1923 Land Act at actually almost every opportunity. This is the act which allowed tenants to buy their own farms by either confiscating estates from landlords or forcing them to sell through compulsory purchase orders. The culmination of land agitation and a series of legal challenges since the 1880s. As Michael D. argues, following the work of historians such as Terence Dooley, the Land Acts punctuate the decline of landlordism, but the transformation in land ownership also created a new class, a class of small farmers, farm owners. And in Higgins' words, it was as a consequence of the 1923 Act, and I'm quoting him now, that the alliance of land before people, authoritarianism, misogyny, and distrust of the body as sinful came to define the 1930s awful legacy of repression. Higgins focuses on the impact of the Land Acts on those without land, both those who never acquired it. In 1923, his own father missed out as he was interned in the Curragh at the time, but also those who did not inherit, the surplus people who were neither going to be the one inheriting male or the one daughter with the dowry, the surplus relatives assisting on farms, or those leaving for England whose emigrant remittances were so welcome, but whose personal arrivals or retirements were greeted on occasion with a, "What are you doing home?" or "When are you going back?" I think what is missing from Higgins' analysis is recognition of the impact on those who did inherit land, or who were able to buy land, as my grandparents did after my grandfather inherited money from a brother who had gone to America in the 1880s. It's here, I think, that, and I'm going back to Higgins's quote, "the misogyny and distrust of the body as sinful make themselves most felt, because once you have land, you have to worry about legitimate inheritance." Michael D. signs off a recent address on the Land Acts with the following assertion. He says, "It is very hard to disagree with Professor Joe Lee's statement when he described how, before the Great Famine, fields gave way to families, whereas after the famine, families gave way to fields." The statement comes from J.J. Lee's Ireland 1912 to 1985, and of course derives from Patrick Kavanagh's The Great Hunger, specifically the mother's advice to Patrick Maguire in praise of the man who makes the field his bride. The sacrifice of the family for the sake of land ownership came in many guises, from the refusal of farmers to marry, to the refusal of women like my grandmother to countenance her son's marriage to a woman she considered sexually wayward. You may recall that earlier I said my grandmother herself had been pregnant before marriage, but she was at that time a servant. The man she married was a farm labourer. In 1920, neither her own family nor her lovers owned any land, and legitimacy in that context bears far less weight. I'm coming to a close now. One of the questions we need to ask of consent, why people consented to and even approved of the institutions for so long, is how and why that changed. Nobody now defends the system, or rather, very few people do. There are obvious generational shifts to take into account here. The decline in deference to the church, the impact of feminism and the movement for reproductive rights, the role of the media and journalism in highlighting the plight of women such as Anne Lovett or Joanne Hayes, or the X case, or more recently the scandal of coerced adoptions. But there is something missing if we think of these shifts only or primarily in terms of public opinion and public accountability. I was a graduate student in Oxford in 1890, because I'm very well preserved. In 1989, when I gave birth to my son Jacob. And one of the first events I went to with my small baby in a sling was Seamus Heaney's first lecture as Oxford Professor of Poetry. That was also the year Margot Harkin released Hushabye Baby, a film about Derry teenagers, the Troubles, and a crisis pregnancy. You may remember the schoolroom scene of the 15-year-old child, Goretti, who was secretly pregnant, reading Limbo in class for her English GCSE. "Why?" the teacher asks. Does Heaney say, ducking him tenderly, "What's this about a minnow with hooks?" This sequence is about the speech that can be heard if we learn how to listen. Heaney's poem speaks to those like Goretti who know how to hear. The film was made in the aftermath of the death of Anne Lovett in January 1984 and of the Kerry baby's case later that same year. At one point in the film, we see a blue bag caught in the swell on a beach, referencing the baby found washed in at White Strand, Carthaven in April 1984. Well, on the radio in Goretti's family's kitchen, we hear a debate about the Eighth Amendment to the Constitution and the right to life of the unborn. Harkin is asking us, via Heaney, to think about the distance between public discourse and private familial experience, and how stories get handed on and interpreted. The radio spews the media's language about families, politics, reproductive rights and wrongs, but inside, the family itself is not talking. Goretti and her mother are, in Heaney's words, allied and at bay, engaged in silent communication, a bit like the game of noughts and crosses in Clearances. But as Heaney reminds us, silences and the way we govern our tongue are also forms of care. My family's relationship with the institutions enabled forms of violence and exclusion. But the fact that in the 1980s, my cousins and I felt supported when we chose to keep our children is a testament to the care that was also the inheritance from our family. And in this too, I think my family was typical. It was inside the private world of the family, as much as in public political discourse, that tolerance and compassion were incubated. To return to the questions I posed at the beginning, how do we approach the aftermath of the scandals of institutional abuse in Ireland? What questions should we be asking about guilt, blame, and responsibility? My own feeling is that outside of legal claims for reparation and financial redress, both of which I see as absolutely vital and necessary and overdue, but outside of these legal claims against the state, the term responsibility is not a particularly useful word to bring to this history, because it so quickly falls into binary arguments about blame and guilt. I think we need to think in terms of a kind of wider category of answerability or obligation. In this wider sense, I am answerable to this history. I got to belong when my cousin didn't. I have suffered the loss of my cousin, but I also benefited in complex ways from her absence. I think that people feel relatively comfortable when I say I feel responsible for, in the sense of answerable to, this injustice. But not always when I suggest that they are too. My granny is your granny. Not everyone wants to go there. I recognise the value of secret keeping. It's not all about shame. Maintaining reserve is one way that people living in small communities can continue to live with one another, for example. There is a kind of power associated with secrets, but also a form of care. Maybe this has partly to do with a society that makes use of the confessional. There's a power in telling secrets, but also a power in keeping them, and the figure of a priest is a good reminder of that. But secrets outlive their usefulness, and they become more dangerous in their posthumous incarnations. My family kept the secrets of sex and pregnancy and childbirth for a mixture of reasons, and some of them were good. But there is no sense in keeping those secrets anymore. We will never make sense of the missing if we don't talk about them. We will never accept our own accountability unless we address this history. I think that is precisely what that figure of Bill Evans is asking of us. McGahan has put in there to try to get us to acknowledge how we all turn away and hope to avoid questions about our own complicity and the ways in which some of us in the aftermath of this history have become beneficiaries while others have not. A final thought takes me to Walter Benjamin and his wonderfully utopian vision in the Arcades project that the future is locked in the undiscovered aspects of the past, accessible through a practice honed by the rag picker who works his way through the refuse of the past and brings the discarded remnants of history to new light. You know, the rag picker might be something like the story of Heaney's cobblestone that we can dispose or we can place in new contexts. This is the key to the aftermath of violence and to a new future. The aftermath is the new growth that replaces the past that has been mown down and cast aside. If we are to have any hope of acknowledging the violence of the home, both familial and institutional, we must look to the people and the stories that have been cast aside. Thank you very much for your attention.